Hello, and in this video, I'm going to talk about how to fly from the US to Europe without doing an overnight flight. So, doing morning flights from the east coast mainly of the US to the UK. Since about 2016, I've only taken one night flight back from the US to the UK, and that was in a very plush JetBlue suite. And even that I didn't enjoy. I just really don't like sleeping on planes or attempting to sleep on planes. So every single time I've come back from the US, I always go via somewhere that has a morning flight back to the UK. Now there's actually more options than I thought. I've taken most of them. There's also a new JetBlue option, which is going to be interesting to try out. So in this video, I'm going to talk about all the options you have if you want to go from the US to Europe without doing an overnight flight, without having to sleep on a plane. So let's go through the options one by one and determine which is the best depending on what you're trying to do. Now, looking at the map of the US, there are only certain airports that you can fly direct to London Heathrow. There are no places in the US where you can fly to anywhere apart from London Heathrow directly. Now, it is possible to fly to London Heathrow indirectly from other cities and avoid the need for a night flight. And similarly, if you fly from somewhere like Boston, which arrives in London fairly early in the evening, it is possible to connect and fly to other cities in Europe via London Heathrow Airport. So the cities that support direct flights to London Heathrow and kind of the hubs, so to speak, in terms of picking a morning flight are Chicago, Boston, New York, both Newark and JFK, and also Washington Dulles International Airport. So let's have a look at the flights that are available from the US to London Heathrow. I've used a tool here called ITA Matrix, which is pretty good for finding out every single flight everywhere. With quite a bit of jiggery pokery, I've managed to get this list of flights up with removing all the code shares. So you'll see, for example, all the British Airways flights are listed as American flights as well, but they are actually British Airways flights. And similarly, the American ones will be listed as British Airways flights because you can buy them on a British Airways ticket, but they are actually an American flight. So I've removed all the code shares. The newest one that I didn't know about was JetBlue are now doing a flight from JFK to Heathrow, which I'll have to try at some point. As you can see, there's actually quite a lot of options and choices, mostly from New York airports, though there is the British Airways from Boston flight, which is really good if you're looking to connect into Europe because it arrives at almost 7 o'clock in the evening in UK time. So you would have enough time to connect to a flight that was lying somewhere in Europe at 9 or even probably 8 if you're lucky. Similarly, there's also a late American flight from JFK. So if you could get to JFK by, say, 8:30 or 8 o'clock, you could probably connect to that flight, depending on which terminal it arrived in. Similarly, there's this flight from Chicago, which doesn't leave especially early. Obviously, there's no room for connecting in Europe from the Chicago flight. But there is the possibility, if you could get a very early flight to Chicago, that you could connect onto this flight. You'd have to, ideally, you want an American flight so that all on one ticket, so that you would be okay if you missed this flight. But it is theoretically possible to connect to Chicago Airport. If you arrived at, say, 7 o'clock and you were hopefully in the same terminal in Chicago, you could probably connect through and use this flight, say from somewhere like Minneapolis or Kansas City. So let's talk about each city in turn. The first airport we're going to talk about is Chicago O'Hare. This is totally useless if you want to connect anywhere in Europe, but it's really good for US connections just because where it is in the US. So it's the longest flight from America to Europe that is in the daytime. The on-site hotel is actually in the terminals. Next up we have Washington Dulles Airport, and a reasonable option for connections because there are a lot of early morning flights to Washington DC. The hotel situation isn't as great as somewhere like O'Hare though, because while there is an on-site hotel, it's not actually apparently that walkable to any of the terminal buildings. So you need to get the shuttle. So that's a bit of a down point with Washington Dulles Airport. Next up, we have Newark Airport, which actually has two flights. So you can actually do connections both in the US and in Europe from Newark. Again, the hotel that is closest to Newark Airport is in the airport grounds, but it's not actually easy to get to the terminals apparently with walking. So that's a down point for Newark. Now, JFK is probably the major hub for morning flights. As you can see, there's 4 flights from JFK, including one from JetBlue, one from British Airways, one from American, and one from Virgin. You've got the 916 flight from American, and that's very good for connections from the US to JFK. And similarly, the 755 BA flight is very good for connections in Europe. In terms of hotels, there's one on-site hotel, the TWA hotel, which is quite expensive, but it's right next to the JetBlue terminal, which I think is Terminal 5. So that makes it more convenient than some of the other options if you want to stay on site at JFK Airport. Finally, we have Boston Logan Airport, which has a very early flight to the UK that arrives the earliest of any of the flights in the UK. So if you want to do a European connection, then Boston is probably the way to go. It has got an on-site hotel that can access reasonably quickly the international terminal. So I'd consider that another good choice if you want to stop over at Boston Airport before going out. And that's my summary of the morning flights from the US to the UK to avoid having to sleep on a plane. Now, I will caveat this with a few things. Firstly, I've never ever tried to take a connection at either end from one of these morning flights. So when I say that you can do a European connection, I think by looking at the Heathrow arrivals and the advice that it says you should spend about an hour for a single terminal connection and an hour and a half for a multi-terminal connection at Heathrow, that those European connection options will work. Also, there are some late flights from Heathrow that you could get with any of these, but that kind of defeats the object because then you're doing an overnight flight after you arrive in Heathrow. So you can fly to Dubai, for example, after doing the daytime flight to Heathrow, but I'm not sure what exactly you gain from that, apart from maybe if you really love traveling and you don't mind sleeping on planes, but you want to do a stupidly long connecting flight. So that's the first point. The second point is I can't really talk about the Newark and Dulles Airport hotels because I haven't stayed in either of them. I've stayed in the Chicago Airport Hotel, I've stayed in the Boston Airport Hotel, and I've stayed in the TWA Hotel. And they're all walkable to the airport. But I have stayed in a lot of off-site hotels, and personally, while you can do that, it very much depends on the airport. So JFK has quite good public transport connections to the local area. That's probably true for Newark as well. Dulles Airport, I had an airport hotel which took half an hour to get a cab from that hotel to the airport just because of the traffic in Dulles is terrible. Now I know that they've built the Silver Line extension to Dulles now, so it may be possible to get a hotel somewhere like Reston on the Silver Line and take that in to Dulles Airport as a way of doing an early morning flight from Dulles. So that might be a good option. So all of these are possible options depending on where you're trying to get from and to. And additionally, I've never obviously taken a US connection in the morning. I would put some caveats about that. Often you can connect quite quickly in the US. If it's the same airline and the same terminal, then I think you've got a good chance of doing a morning connection if it's about an hour or more gap at one of these airports. That will be the caveat. But there are quite a lot. I mean, if you go to these airports' websites and look at the arrival times for flights on any particular day, then you'll see there's quite a lot of connecting flights you could take that will get you there about 7:30, 7, 8 sometimes for the late flight at JFK, which means that you could, in theory, do a morning flight to one of these airports and then connect to Europe. So the question is, when you're getting up at 4 in the morning, is that really a morning flight or is that just an overnight flight that's starting early? I don't know what it is, but for some reason, transatlantic flights are almost always cheaper on a per leg basis as a return flight. So you can pay like $600 for a single flight and then find the return flight is like $700, for example. There's very little gain in not booking a return flight. So that's just something to be aware of when you're trying to book these morning flights. You should try and book them with the return flight. Additionally, if you are checking in luggage, then you almost certainly want to make sure, if you're trying to make a connection, that you fly with the same airline so that they can check the baggage all the way through to the UK or your final European destination. So that's just something else to be aware of. Connections are a lot harder to make with luggage if you have to pick it up and then change again. So that's something else to be aware of when you're trying to book these flights. So hopefully you've enjoyed this video. If you did like this video, subscribe, and I'll have another video up here, which will be the next video, which I haven't made yet. So if you're watching this and there isn't a video up here, it means I haven't assigned it yet. Otherwise, hope you enjoyed this video and let me know in the comments if you've taken a morning flight or if you're thinking about taking a morning flight and what your experiences are or were.